In today's episode, we're gonna frame a deck. I'm Andrew from the Andrew Thron Improvements YouTube channel, and over the past couple years, I've built quite a few decks, some small like this one, and some pretty large like the one that we're building today. But no matter what size deck you're building, the framing fundamentals can still be broken up into 4 major projects. In this video, I am going to show you every aspect of the deck framing process, and I'm going to show you the Power Pro products that I use for a super durable deck that's going to last a long time. Let's get this deck framing party started with the ledger board. The ledger board attaches to the house right here, and it's one of the most important parts of any deck. But if the ledger board is not flashed correctly, you can have a ton of rot and water damage, so I was pretty terrified to see what I would find behind this existing flashing. So here's how we look with the existing flashing removed. Honestly, not too bad. There's a few areas like here and here with a little bit of rotting, but honestly, better than I expected. So the first step in getting a new ledger board mounted is I want to apply waterproofing to the rim joist on the house. I'm using a waterproof ice and water shield that I had left over from a previous project, but really any waterproof membrane will work. I like to leave the flashing long and then I'll come back later on and cut it with a utility knife. But you're gonna run this all along the rim joist and do everything you can to protect as much of your house as possible. And going back to that existing metal flashing, I wanna address a pet peeve of mine. I feel like everyone is very quick to judge the work that was done before them, saying it was wrong and it was improper, yada, yada, yada. You guys know the saying that today's state of the art is tomorrow's butchery. So that flashing probably was exactly what people were doing at the time, and it seemed to work okay. To set the mounting height for my ledger board, I like to use a laser level to get that projection level across the flashing. I like to set my ledger board about 3 inches below the door threshold because I want to have 1 inch for the decking and then maybe 2 inches so water doesn't end up making its way into my house under a heavy rain. And you always want to snap a chalk line on top of the laser level because that laser level is going to run out of batteries or die or just be hard to see. Your ledger board is typically going to be a 2x8 or 2x10 piece of pressure treated lumber, and you want to make sure that you crown all of your lumber before you install it. I'll talk more about that later. I like to position the ledger board on my level line and then tack it in place with some 3-inch framing nails. Having a second set of hands really helps when setting your ledger board, and don't worry, we're going to go back with some heavy duty fasteners later on. These nails are just to hold it in place temporarily. And I feel like everybody sets their ledger board a little bit different. This is just how I do it. And speaking of which, I apply a piece of 6-inch flashing on top of the ledger board just like this. My idea is that we're not going to have water getting behind the ledger board if we install this flashing now. Now, some people will argue that this is incredibly redundant because I'm going to go back after applying this flashing and I'm going to install a piece of metal or vinyl ledger flashing right on top of it. So some would argue this is unnecessary, but this is kind of the belt and suspenders approach that I've used for the past decks I've built. So let me know if you think this is overkill or what you do for your deck. I don't know. I just feel like I'd rather be safe than sorry. I like to nail either the metal or the vinyl flashing to the house every 18 to 24 inches or so. And I wish I had vinyl flashing, but they only had metal available at my local hardware store. And if your deck is going to be longer than 8 feet, chances are you're going to have to overlap some of your ledger flashing. And for this, you want to apply some caulk to one end and then overlap it by about 4 inches. The logic here is that if any water makes its way on that ledger flashing, it won't be able to go underneath because of the caulking you put in place. And don't forget to nail the overlap. I'm using a roofing nailer for this, but a hammer and a nail will work just fine. And if you find yourself thinking, wow, must be nice to have a roofing nailer or all these tools, just know that they all have a story and a terrible project behind them because roofing is not fun, especially in 90-degree heat. I use tin snips to make any cuts or adjustments to this metal flashing. Again, I would go with vinyl if you can find it, and that way you can just use a utility knife or some regular scissors to cut it, but it's really not too bad either way. And you might be thinking, oh no, now you got the nail holes for water penetration. Well, here comes the last layer of waterproofing, which is a piece of joist tape that goes on top of all those nails. So at this point, if you're keeping track, we have the belt, the suspenders, and at this point we have a couple safety pins. Our pants are not falling, and hopefully our deck is not rotting. Now, to actually secure that ledger board to the house permanently, I'm using some LedgerTite Screws 3 5/8 by Power Pro, and I'm going to put these every 12 inches or so. The actual requirements for your ledger screws in terms of size and spacing is in your building code, so make sure you consult that. And these LedgerTite structural screws require no pre-drilling, and they install 30% faster than many of the other screws on the market. And the last thing you want is for one of your ledger screws to get in the way of your joist. So it's a great idea to mark your either 16-inch or 12-inch on center joist spacing before you put these screws in to ensure that you don't have a conflict. I'm doing 16-inch on-center joist spacing, which we'll talk about later, so I just did 2 screws between each joist bed. And I like to stagger them one high, one low. One thing I do want to mention is that some people are getting away from ledger boards and instead they're installing a second beam right up next to the house, but we're going with the old school ledger board for this deck. With the ledger board installed, let's talk about the posts and beams. In order to get the height for the posts, I like to use a laser level to project a line along the bottom of the ledger board here. Since we're using 2x8 joists, the bottom of the joist will be at the bottom of the ledger board. To mark the cut line on the 6x6 we're using for posts, I stand them up in the post hardware and then I mark the laser line where it intersects with that post. Make sure that your post is all the way at the bottom of the hardware and that you use a post level to make sure that it's perfectly plumb before you make your mark. And if you're wondering how I laid out the footers and actually dug and poured the concrete footers, I covered all that in my previous deck building videos. I'll link them down below. Using the 10-foot long 6x6s was a little bit unruly, so feel free to trim them down a little bit before you put them in the hardware, but I just kept them long and muscled my way through it. To cut the 6x6s, I just used a miter saw, and the annoying thing about a 6x6 is usually you're gonna have to cut one side and then flip it over and cut the other. A little bit annoying, but you'll get through it. And for my last deck, I used 4x4 posts. I just felt like for this deck and what it's gonna be supporting, a 6x6 was the right call. So a little bit heavier, a little bit more expensive, but I think I'll sleep better at night. And if you're paranoid that your laser level is not calibrated or something, you can double check everything with a 6-foot level, but you should be in good shape. When it comes to installing the beam, code prohibits any kind of side mounting to the post. I've seen plenty of decks with this type of beam and it puts all of the stress on the hardware and none on the post. No bueno. Option number 2 is to mount the beams directly on top of the post with a piece of hardware. But I think we can do better with the third option, which is to notch the post. I have a 2x10 beam, so we're gonna cut the notch for that right now. Now, when it comes to notching your posts, you first wanna get your beam width. This is about 9.5 inches, but this can vary between, a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch between boards. So you definitely wanna know the width of the beam you're gonna be installing on the post. So we got 9.5 here, and then we're gonna take that 9.5 and we're gonna mark it on the post. So 9.5, we'll go ahead and mark it right here. Okay, then we're just gonna rotate this and mark it on the sides as well. Each 2x10 should be a 1/2 inch, so your beam really should be 3 inches, but I'm gonna go 3 1/4 to make sure that we're fully nested. We'll mark 3 1/4 right here, and then we'll also mark it at the top right here. Okay, we'll go ahead and mark that, and then we'll flip it over and do it on the other side as well. And once we have the notches marked, we're gonna go ahead and cut it with a circular saw. And we'll just keep rotating it through. And again, the annoying thing about a 6x6 is you'll probably have to use a recip saw or something to get all the way through the deep cuts, but you'll get through it eventually. And I want to make sure that the post is not sticking up past the beam, so I cut around a 1/2 inch off right there. Then I grabbed all my posts and positioned them in place. And whenever you cut pressure treated lumber, you want to go ahead and retreat the cut ends. I'll link this product down below, but this is going to help the deck to last as long as possible. With the posts ready, I made sure that my beams were perfectly in line before nailing them together with a few 3-inch framing nails. I'll screw the beams together later, but that's good enough to get it over to the posts. And I don't know if you guys have ever lifted up a 2x10x16 soaking wet piece of pressure treated lumber, but the beam, believe it or not, is twice as heavy as one of those. So a little bit brutal, but I was able to get it up there. And a lot of these DIY YouTubers want you to believe that everything always goes according to plan and that it's all sunshine and rainbows. Well, have you ever been dead-legged by a 60-pound 2x10 double beam? Yeah, me neither. What a weird question. And it's funny because right before this fell, I remember thinking, wow, I really can't believe that this has gone so smoothly and nothing's fallen over yet. So I might have mind manifested that one, but eventually we got everything in place. When it comes to attaching the beams to the post, the old school method is to drill a 5/8 inch hole through and then use a 1/2 inch through bolt with a washer and a nut on the end before tightening everything up. But nowadays, most people are using these through lock lag screws, which require no pre-drilling, and they replace that 1/2 inch carriage bolt. So it's a little bit faster to go all the way through. These bolts are a little bit more expensive, but you're just gonna go ahead and drill through, put on the washer, thread on the nut head right there, and then just tighten it up a little bit more from the screw side. You're gonna need 2 of these through lock bolts per post beam connection, unless your beam has a splice at that post, in which case you need 4. And you wanna make sure that all of your posts are perfectly plumb, so confirm that with a post level before you attach them to the beam. And the last step for this part of the project is to waterproof the beam. The last thing you want is water collecting in between those 2 beam boards, causing it to rot out prematurely. Putting this 6-inch piece of flashing over that beam is going to prevent water from getting in between them and help your deck to last as long as possible. With the beams installed, it's time to talk about the joists. For the outermost joist, I'm using a concealed joist hanger, and I was told that this is the right size for a 2x8, but I guess it's the same for a 2x6. You need to make sure that your outermost joist is perfectly perpendicular to the ledger board, i.e. square, and that's important because we're gonna pull all our measurements from this outermost joist. And to confirm square, I'm using the Pythagorean theorem, the 3-4-5 method, but any right triangle like a 6-8-10 will also give you a more accurate measurement. Once you have the 6-foot leg and the 8-foot leg of the triangle marked, you're just gonna pivot that outermost joist until the hypotenuse is exactly 10 feet. Check out my deck planning video for more info on this, but I don't really care how you get there, just make sure you're square. After confirming square, I attach the joist to the beam using one of these rafter ties. I only used a rafter tie for the outermost joist because I didn't want to be able to see the hardware from the outside. With the outermost joist installed and square, it's time to install the rest of the joists. If you didn't mark your joist locations as part of the ledger board installation, go ahead and do that now. 16-inch on-center joist spacing is by far the most common, but some people will install 12-inch on-center joists if they're installing a certain type of decking or if they're doing a different orientation for the decking boards. And before you even think about hanging your first joist, you want to make sure that you crown every single joist. The crown is a slight upward arching curvature that you'll see when you look down a board's longest edge. Crown up for all joists. I eventually figured out the fastest and best way to install joists, but I first had to fumble through some bad attempts like this one, where I tried to use the tab and then hold the joist and the joist hanger at the same time. It was not easy.
All right, after doing about 15 of these, I think I finally got the system.
I found that positioning the top of the joist even with the top of the ledger board and then nailing it in from the top with a framing nailer was a great way to tack it in temporarily, where I could adjust it, make sure it was right on line with my mark, and then attach the joist hardware later. Also, these Simpson joist hangers have requirements for all the hardware you need to use. I'll link it all down below. But I really think this is the secret sauce. You're just gonna mark your joist location, position the joist so it's right on your marked line, use that framing nailer to tack it in place so it's right flush with the top of the ledger board, and then hands-free, baby. It's just hanging exactly where it needs to be. You can take your time installing that joist hanger. And I actually installed 4 nails and then 2 screws to attach the joist hanger to the ledger board. I don't know why, but I just decided to mix and match the screws and nails, and then obviously you're gonna use the longer screws to go through the side compartments there, through the joist and into the ledger board. Just make sure that you go back and make sure that nail that you put in to hold it in place isn't sticking up past the top of the joist. And again, you really should mark the joist location on the beam. I forgot to do this, so I just had to do a 16-inch on-center offset from the previously installed joist. This was very inefficient. You should 100% mark your beam the same time you mark your ledger so that all of your joist spacing is coordinated. And I'm installing hurricane ties at all of these joist beam connections.
When we get to the end of the ledger board, I'm gonna do a concealed joist hanger.
Just like we did for the outermost joist on the other side.
So then we're gonna take our last joist and slip it in.
And if you're wondering where that extra joist came from, stay tuned, I'll explain that in a little while. Also, I installed these super tall 6x6s for something that I'm pretty excited about in the future, but another little teaser, hopefully this ends up turning out pretty well.
Yikes.
Now, 95% of decks are just gonna have one beam, but if you have a massive deck like I do and you have a multiple beam, multiple joist situation, here's how I did it. I staggered the joist so I could attach one joist to the other joist. Here it's on the inside, and to get my outermost joist, I just mounted another 2x8 to the outside of it using a laser level to make sure I was perfectly square. For the joists that are going to be sistered together, make sure you pick joists that are similar in size so that one's not sticking up past the other, and and I used a couple framing nails to attach them to each other, and I also attached a joist hanger, but personally I think this was completely unnecessary. Then I just made sure that I was maintaining the proper joist spacing and offsets before securing the joist to the remaining beams using a bunch of hurricane ties. Now, I will be the first person to admit that this deck is probably completely overbuilt. I am hopefully going to be installing a hot tub towards the back of the deck right here, which is why I have so many beams, but even with a hot tub, this is probably overkill. And don't get me wrong, I would prefer to overbuild a deck than underbuild it any day of the week, but it is a lot of extra cost and materials, and it takes a lot of time because now I'm installing 3 times as many hurricane ties, and honestly, those took the longest. The last step is to install the rim joist on the end of our other joists, but I like to put the decking boards on first. Let me explain.
I like to leave my joists long until I get to the very last row. So this board right here is going to be my last row of boards, and then I'm going to have one more board that goes on the end, which is going to complete my picture frame. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position this board in place, and I'm going to mark all of the joists so I know where this is going to end.
So obviously I'm fast forwarding here to where I already installed the decking boards, but I want to mark both on the top and the sides of the joists where that last composite board is going to be.
Okay, so this is the mark for the end of our last board. And because we have to attach the rim joist and I also want a 1-inch overhang, I created this jig here, which is 2.5 inches. So I'm going to position that on my initial mark right here, and then I'm going to mark the inside, and that way I know where to cut to get us exactly where we need to be. So this was the mark for the end of the board. This is where we're going to cut because we're going to have a 1.5 inch rim joist, and then I want to have a 1-inch overhang with the board over the edge of the deck.
To make all these cuts, I'm using a circular saw, and I like to cut from up above. That way you're not really dealing with the dust in your face. With all of the joists cut to size, it's time to install the rim joist, and I like to hang up a little piece of blocking that I can use as a second set of hands to hold the rim joist in place so I can nail it to the end of the joist. And you may need to install a piece of blocking if you're going to have 2 pieces of rim joist that come together. And as with the rest of the deck, make sure that you're crowning all of your lumber and that you're treating all of your cut edges. And installing the rim joist is one of the more exciting parts of the project because you're basically at the home stretch. You can kind of get an idea of what the deck's going to look like, and I also recommend that you go back and put in a few screws. I recommend that you keep some 3-inch exterior rated Power Pro screws on hand for any deck project, since you're going to need them for things like the rim joist like I'm installing here, but also for the blocking and a bunch of other locations. And finally, it's time to talk about the blocking and waterproofing, as well as a few finishing touches. First, if you left any of your beams or your joists long, go back now and cut them off to size. And if your joist span is longer than 8 feet, it's recommended that you put in some blocking at the midpoint of your joist span to keep the joists from twisting, and also so the deck functions as one complete unit. I like to stagger the blocking to make it easy to nail, but you can also toenail it in from the side. And if you're going to be installing a railing, you might want to consider installing a piece of horizontal blocking so that when you install your railing posts, you have plenty of wood and meat for the screws to grab into when you go to install them. For my previous decks, I skipped this step, and as a result, I had to install some supplemental blocking from underneath the deck to position it directly below the railing posts. This was fine, it was just kind of a pain in the butt, so I figured, hey, why not install some horizontal blocking for this deck and see if it's my new go-to going forward. And if your deck is going to be longer than 20 feet, you might want to consider installing a breaker board so that you don't have a butt joint where your 2 boards come together. We're going to talk more about the breaker board in next week's composite decking video, but you want to make sure that you put in provisions to support it during the framing stage. Here's a look at the deck with all of the blocking and breaker board supports in. Now let's make our deck last forever.
And before I completely finish up with the framing, I'm going to install some joist tape here on each one of the joists. And the idea of joist tape is that it's going to help to waterproof all the joists and help them to last almost as long as the composite decking that we're going to install next. If I recall correctly, I think pressure treated lumber lasts for like 20 or 25 years, and I think most composite decking has like a warranty for like 35 years. So if this tape gives me an extra 10 years, I think I'll be pretty happy with that. And this right here is Power Pro joist tape, and I will link it down in the video description.
Basically, this joist tape from Power Pro is going to prevent water from ponding and potentially rotting the board at the top of the joist. So overall, this should extend the lifetime, and it's become common practice for the tops of joists in recent years. And if there are any deck builders watching this video, let me know your opinions on joist tape. Do you think it's worth it to actually install, or is it all hype? And if you installed any blocking or breaker board supports, make sure you waterproof all that as well, because these are probably even more important than your joists in terms of waterproofing all of those openings. Now let's take a quick reminder look at where this project started And here is a look at the fully framed deck. Thanks to the Power Pro LedgerTite screws, the exterior rated screws, and the joist tape that we installed on top of the joists, I think this deck is going to last a very long time. Head over to the Andrew Thron Improvements YouTube channel if you want to see how I installed the composite decking. Be sure to subscribe to the Power Pro channel for more home improvement content, and thank you all very much for watching.